Two figures in dark tactical gear were creeping into my private armory at 3 in the morning, laughing and whispering about how much they were going to get paid for this, recovery, job. But the second that heavy electromagnetic deadbolt slammed home with a sound like a guillotine hitting a block, the laughter didn't end oppose. Tea just stopped. It evaporated into a cold, suffocating silence that smelled of grease and sudden regret. You see, breaking into a man's house is a bold choice, but getting yourselves locked inside the high-security vault of a retired state trooper who spent 20 years dealing with people exactly like you is what we call a career-ending mistake. And as I watched them on a monitor from my workshop across the yard, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, I knew the next few hours were going to be the most educational experience of their lives. But to understand how we got to that steel door slamming shut, you have to understand the kind of peace I was looking for when I hung up the badge 5 years ago, because after 2 decades of high-speed chases, domestic disputes, and seeing the absolute worst things human beings can do to one another, I just wanted a piece of land where the only thing I had to worry about was the weather and the price of diesel. I bought 40 acres of rolling hills and ancient oak trees out in a county where the neighbors are miles apart, and the silence is so thick you can hear your own heartbeat on a still night. Building my house with my own 2 hands, and installing a custom storm shelter that eventually became my armory, a place where I kept my grandfather's old hunting rifles and the tools of a trade I'd left behind, not because I was paranoid, but because I believe a man is responsible for what's his. Everything was perfect for 3 years, just me and my 2 hounds, Blue and Belle, walking the perimeter and watching the sun set behind the ridge, until a developer with more money than sense bought the cattle ranch across the county road and decided the world needed a gated community called, the Heights at Willow Creek, a place where every lawn had to be exactly 3 inches tall and the mailboxes all had to be the same shade of, eggshell sand, And with that neighborhood came the person who would eventually try to ruin my life. A woman named Victoria Vance, who was elected president of the Willow Creek HOA and decided that her authority shouldn't just stop at the gated entrance, but should extend to every acre of land she could see from her second-story balcony. Victoria was the kind of woman who wore pressed linens to a gravel road meeting and spoke in a tone of voice that suggested she was constantly smelling something unpleasant, and our first meeting was a sign of the storm to come. As I was out on my porch one Saturday morning, cleaning an old 1894 Winchester that had been in my family since the Great Depression, just enjoying the mechanical rhythm of the work, when I saw a luxury SUV stop at my front gate and a woman climb out like she was stepping onto a red carpet. She marched up to the fence line, pointing a manicured finger at my porch and screaming about how she had children living in the, civilized, world across the street, and that seeing a, weapon of war, was creating a hostile environment for her community, even though I was 300 yards away on my own private property, and when I politely told her that my land was an oppose part of her jurisdiction and that she was welcome to keep driving, the look she gave me was an oppose just anger. It was a promise of war. She didn't oppose start with a direct attack because people like Victoria are too cowardly for that. So she started with the, whisper campaign, using the community Facebook page to turn me into the neighborhood boogeyman, telling families that I was a, traumatized ex-cop with a hair-trigger temper, who was, stockpiling an illegal arsenal, just waiting for a reason to snap. I started noticing the cars slowing down as they passed my gate, parents pulling their kids away if I happened to be out by the mailbox, and the friendly nods from the local ranchers started being replaced by uneasy glances, because even if a lie is obvious, if you tell it loud enough and long enough, it starts to stain the truth, and Victoria was a master at the art of the slow burn. Then came the, official, visits, starting with 2 young guys in polo shirts with, Willow Creek Security, patches who showed up at my gate with a clipboard, claiming they had a, community safety mandate, to inspect my firearm storage because of reports of, unsafe discharges, on my property, which was a total fabrication since the only thing I'd fired in months was a starter pistol to train my dogs. I looked at their, mandate, which was printed on letterhead that looked like it was made on a home printer, and I recognized the signs of a power trip immediately. So I told them they had 10 seconds to get off my gravel before I called the sheriff, who happened to be a guy I'd mentored back in the day, and they scrambled back to their car like kick curs. But as they left, the younger one, a kid named Leo, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, gave me a look that said he was sorry, a look that told me he knew this was wrong, but was too scared of Victoria to stop it. Things hit a boiling point when Victoria tried to use the law against me, filing for temporary restraining order and firearm seizure, under a state statute that usually only applies to people in an actual mental health crisis, claiming that my presence was a direct threat to the welfare of the children in Willow Creek. And it was only because the local judge knew my service record that the petition was laughed out of court, but Victoria wasn't oppose. The type to take no. For an answer, she took it as a personal insult to her status as the queen of her little suburban empire. One night, about a week after the court hearing, I heard a quiet knock on my back door, which is unusual since my gate is locked, and I have enough sensors to detect a squirrel and oppose as heartbeat. And when I looked at the camera, I saw Leo, the young security guard, standing there trembling and holding a thick manila envelope like it was a live grenade. I let him in, and he spilled everything, telling me how Victoria had gone off the rails, how she'd been using HOA dues, tens of thousands of dollars, to hire, private recovery specialists, from the city to come out and perform what she called community safety retrieval, which was just a fancy term for a home invasion and grand larceny. He handed me the envelope, and inside were copies of emails, bank transfers, and a detailed map of my house that someone had clearly drawn while spying through the trees with a long lens, and the most damning part was liability waiver, she'd forged with Leo's signature, intending to blame him and the security team if the whole thing went south. Leo was terrified, sobbing about how he just needed a job to pay for his mom's medical bills and didn't oppose. Know he was signing up for a criminal conspiracy, so I told him to go home, keep his mouth shut, and let me handle it, because now for the first time in years, the part of my brain was fully awake, and I was starting to see a very clear way to end this once and for all. The plan was for them to come on a Tuesday night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, thinking I'd be in a deep sleep after a few beers, and they'd use a master key system Victoria thought I didn't oppose. Know she'd bribe a contractor for, but what they didn't oppose, Know, was that I'd spent the last 48 hours turning my house into a digital lobster trap. I didn't oppose. Want to shoot anyone, because that's a headache no one needs, and these guys were just hired muscle who didn't oppose. Realized they were being used by a suburban psychopath, so I decided to let the house do the work, specifically the armory, which I'd rigged with a secondary magnetic locking system that could be triggered from a hidden panel in my detached workshop. I sat in that workshop on the night of the retrieval, watching the monitors as a blacked-out van pulled up to the wood line, and 2 guys hopped out, moving with that fake tactical confidence you see in people who think they oppose. In an action movie, and I watched them bypass my front door, which I'd left conveniently, faulty, and creep down the hallway with their flashlights cutting through the dark. They found the armory door, which I'd left slightly ajar, and I could practically hear their greed through the screen as they saw the collection of vintage steel and brass inside, stepping into the room and dropping their bags to start loading up, and that's when I reached for the switch. Ka-chank. The sound of those 6-inch steel bolts slamming into the frame echoed across the yard, and the visual on the screen was pure comedy, as they both jumped a foot in the air and lunged for the door, pulling and kicking at a slab of reinforced metal that was rated to withstand a Category 5 hurricane, and when they realized they weren't oppose. Getting out, the screaming started. I flipped the toggle for the two-way intercom and cleared my throat, my voice coming through the speakers in the vault with the calm, flat tone of a man who has all the time in the world, and I said, "Gentlemen, you oppose. Currently in a room designed to keep things in, and right now, that includes you, so I oppose. Suggest you sit on the floor and keep your hands visible, because Sheriff Miller is about 4 minutes out, and he's been looking for a reason to ask Mrs. Vance some very difficult questions about where the neighborhood and oppose roof repair fund went." The look of pure, unadulterated terror on their faces was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen, especially when they started babbling into the camera about how, The lady in the white SUV, end quote, told them it was a legal seizure and that they had paperwork, which I told them to hold up the lens so I could get a nice, clear digital record of the forgery for the DA and Oppo's this office. By the time the blue and red lights started reflecting off the oak trees, the two tough guys were sitting back to back on the floor, weeping and promising to tell the police everything if I just let them breathe some fresh air. And when I walked out to meet the sheriff, I handed him the manila envelope and the thumb drive with the last hour of high-definition footage. And I watched his jaw drop as he realized the scale of the insanity Victoria had orchestrated. The arrest of Victoria Vance was a local legend, as the police rolled into the gated community at 6 in the morning and caught her in her silk bathrobe, still clutching a mimosa and trying to scream about, end quote, illegal harassment, end quote, as they cuff her in front of all the neighbors she'd spent months manipulating, and the fallout was like a house of cards collapsing in a windstorm. It turned out she'd been embezzling from the HOA for years to fund a lifestyle she couldn't and Oppo's afford, and the, end quote, gun seizure, end quote, was just a desperate attempt to create a distraction and play the hero before the annual audit revealed she'd drained the accounts. And as the news broke, the, end quote, Willow Creek, end quote, Facebook page turned into a digital bonfire of apologies from neighbors who realized they'd been played for fools. Victoria is currently serving a significant sentence for embezzlement, conspiracy, and solicitation of grand larceny, and the Willow Creek HOA was eventually dissolved by a court order because the financial records were such a disaster that they couldn't and Oppo's even prove who owned the common areas anymore. So now the gates stay open, the mailboxes are starting to turn different colors, and the, end quote, civilized, end quote, world across the street is finally starting to feel like a real neighborhood, instead of a manicured prison. I still sit on my porch on Saturday mornings, cleaning my rifles and watching the sun go down, and occasionally one of the neighbors from across the way will drive by and give me a real wave, not out of fear, but out of a shared understanding that sometimes the biggest threat to a community ISN and Oppo's the guy with the guns, but the person with a clipboard and a desperate need for control. But here's the thing that still bugs me, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately while I'm out fixing fences, because while Victoria went to jail, there are thousands of HOAs just like that one all over the country, run by people who think a little bit of petty authority gives them the right to dictate how a man lives on his own soil. And I wonder if the only reason I won was because I had the background to outsmart them at their own game. It makes me wonder about the folks who don and Oppo's have 20 years of police experience or a high-security vault. The people who just get bullied out of their homes or forced to sell their family history because they can and Oppo's fight the legal fees or the social pressure. And it makes me ask if these organizations are actually protecting property values or if they and Oppo's just legalized gangs for the suburban elite. I've had people tell me I should have just moved, that I was being, end quote, confrontational, end quote, by staying and fighting, but I believe that if you don and Oppo's stand your ground on the small stuff, you won in Oppo's have any ground left when the big stuff comes around. And I'm curious to know what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have played it safe and moved away to avoid the drama? Or would you have built a trap and waited for them to walk right into it? I want to hear your stories about HOA nightmares or overstepping neighbors in the comments, because the more we talk about these, end quote, small time, end quote, tyrants, the harder it is for them to hide in the shadows of their eggshell Sam mailboxes. And if you enjoyed this story of a little bit of country justice, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because out here on the Ridge, we've always got more stories to tell and more fences to mend.